This is Ranger Kidwell-Ross, editor of WorldSweeper.com and the director of the World Sweeping Association. Today, it's my distinct pleasure to be speaking with Randy Neprash. He is a PE, and he'll be discussing, as it says there, the latest information from the state of Minnesota on the ability and relative cost effectiveness of street sweeping to combat phosphorus runoff. He is a staff person for the Minnesota Cities Stormwater Coalition. He's also a co-founder and currently vice chair of the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, which is an organization comprised of state and regional coalitions that are dedicated to reducing stormwater runoff pollution. Randy is also a stormwater regulatory specialist with the community-focused international engineering services company, Stantec Consulting. Randy recently provided the opening statement and laid out the context for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's webinar on street sweeping and urban stormwater. As you will be viewing during today's discussion with me are the ones he used for the MPCA webinar. However, today we will have more time for the discussion than was available in the webinar since there were several other participants. With that, let me welcome you, Randy, along with my thanks for providing this groundbreaking information directly to the worldwide and US power sweeping industry. And there he is.
Thanks, Ranger. Yep. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here today, speaking to your audience. It's worth noting that the perspective of most of my work and also the perspective of why this street sweeping work and news is important is MS4 permitted cities. So MS4 in this case stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems. And it's the national permitting system for urban stormwater discharges. The MS4 program covers more than 7,500 cities in the United States. It is literally every large and medium-sized city in the country and a whole pile of small cities as well. So this is an important regulatory framework. More cities are spending more money to address these stormwater regulations. And street sweeping, it turns out, this is what we're learning slowly but surely. Street sweeping is a really important way to make progress toward meeting regulatory requirements. Turns out it's very cost effective. It's also just plain effective. And when MS4 permits are, and this is happening increasingly around the country, are linked to what are called total maximum daily load studies, TMDLs. Stormwater permits become numeric, and in a lot of cases, a whole lot more stringent and rigorous, and meeting the requirements becomes much more challenging. And cities around the country, it's happening around the world as well, but without the regulations in most cases, cities are increasingly putting more effort, more money, and are more concerned about meeting what are really important environmental regulations. Urban stormwater is a significant form of water pollution. It's one of the largest forms of water pollution in the country, largely because we've done a really good job on the wastewater side. And it's the only form of water pollution that is still growing. I mean, it's still getting worse instead of better, and we're trying to make headway on that. And street sweeping is increasingly an important part of that story. So some of this happens. The Minnesota Cities Stormwater Coalition is the MS4 permitted cities in the state of Minnesota. I've worked with them now for going on 19 years. And then NAMSA, the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, is an organization of state level coalitions of MS4 permitted cities around the country. Remarkably, we've got all these large cities, medium-sized cities as well. There's never been a stakeholder group of those permittees before. NAMSA is really the first group to serve that role. And through NAMSA, we're trying to carry messages about how to do this work effectively, how to meet these regulatory requirements efficiently and effectively to all these cities around the country. So this is part of that broader story, shall we say.
And it's a big story. It's becoming bigger all the time. And we were talking earlier that there are so many cities that are out of compliance with their stormwater permits. And we are just now coming into the study material, thanks to you and the work done by Dr. John Sansaloni in Florida. And those show that, and you only dealt with phosphorus, he dealt with phosphorus and nitrogen, but in very disparate parts of the country, they showed the same thing. The sweeping is astronomically less expensive way to deal with removing phosphorus and nitrogen. So I really look forward to seeing how this plays out and to take a role in furthering this for the sweeping industry.
Yep, great, thank you. That's why this is exciting stuff.
It is.
And big and important news.
It is. Water quality is. They said 30 years ago when I founded American Sweeper magazine that water would be the new oil, and here we are today. My beard's a different color, but nonetheless, yes, it's occurred. So, well, yep. Go ahead. Tell us what you found out in this that was portrayed in the webinar, which is why I invited you here. You were so articulate with us.
Sure, my pleasure. Yes, the MPCA, it's our state environmental agency that runs the MS4 permitting program. You can find this, the trick to finding their webinar is to Google Minnesota Stormwater Manual webinars, and it will take you right to the webpage where a recording of that webinar is stored and available online, as well as the slideshows and such that everybody used. There were researchers, two research leaders of two research teams, one from the University of Minnesota, another from the United States Geological Survey, Bill Selbig, based out of Madison, Wisconsin, and then a team of consultants from Tetra Tech that have been developing a crediting program for the state of Minnesota. But I'll talk about that in more detail. But I can't recommend that webinar more highly. If you're interested in this topic, you want to go look at that.
We'll have that linked in the article that goes with this as well.
Excellent. Okay. So then we should go to the next slide. Here in Minnesota, in the stormwater world, we chase a variety of pollutants. We're always after solids and dirt because a lot of the pollutants are attached to those materials. We chase bacteria, which is interesting and enormously challenging. We also chase trash. But one of the pollutants a type of pollutant that we're after to reduce are nutrients. And it varies from places in the country. In some places they focus more on nitrogen. Here in Minnesota, the nutrient we're after is phosphorus. That's what causes the algae blooms and such in our lakes here. So our work here really focused on how effective street sweeping is in terms of picking up phosphorus. And what we found was that we can measure that quite well. Ranger and I had a conversation about this. One of the challenges was how do you measure phosphorus in street sweepings? You look at a pile of street sweeping, and it's arguably one of the more heterogeneous collections of material you can imagine. Everything is in there. So how do you determine how much phosphorus is actually in a typical pile. How does it relate to the dry weight, the wet weight, et cetera, et cetera. And they worked out an ingenious system where they took a good sized number of random samples from the pile, no matter what the material was, dirt, trash, leaves, dead cats, it was all in there. It all went into the random samples. They then put the samples into containers with ball bearings and put them on paint can shakers. Basically just shook the hell out of these things until what they ended up with was a totally homogeneous powder. And then you could remove the powder, take the ball bearings out, and now you could analyze that material to your little old heart's content. And that's how they were able to measure the phosphorus. Not an exercise that a city is going to do on a regular basis, but it was really appropriate for a good scientific study. And so that's what they have done in now multiple studies. We've been doing this in Minnesota for about 8 years. So we can measure this stuff. It turns out that it's a lot. It's a sizable amount of material. And Ranger, if you can go to the next slide, that includes some material from the researchers where they summarized these things. There we go. So you look at this chart on the left, this is from the University of Minnesota folks. And when you look at the litter fall from trees, so this is seeds, flowers, and leaves mostly, and you look at it as a percentage of the total phosphorus in an urban stormwater system. What they found was that 37 to 64% of the phosphorus in the runoff is coming from this material from trees, and that it really varies depending on the tree canopy cover over the street. Not surprisingly, more trees, more leaves, more organic material, more phosphorus in the stormwater runoff. You then look at the numbers on the right side. This is from Bill Selbig's work in around Madison, Wisconsin. Bill is reporting about 60% of the annual phosphorus yield in the urban stormwater system can come from just leaf litter in the fall. When Bill looked at, he did essentially a paired watershed study in a suburban neighborhood in Madison. He looked at control. So this was one neighborhood where they kind of left things alone. And then he had a test neighborhood where he did more extensive sweeping. The first year, they didn't sweep additionally at all. The second year, they came in and swept extensively. And what they found was that the sweeping reduced the phosphorus by 84%. Yep, big news. So what we're talking about here is a good bit of phosphorus, just in absolute terms. We're talking load here, not concentration, but also a really significant amount percentage of the total phosphorus in an urban stormwater system. It's also appropriate to say that what we're talking about here is street sweeping in residential, largely suburban settings. So one, we're working in neighborhoods where parked cars are really not a significant issue. You know, everybody, it's homes with driveways. And so most of the cars are off the street each night. So that's not a big deal. And in most cases, not highly urbanized, certainly not downtown or commercial areas where you have fewer trees, you got higher levels of trash and such. What we're talking about here are residential, mostly suburban neighborhoods with a good bit of trees and not much of the other stuff. So we could control for a number of things. So we're talking about a good bit of phosphorus. We can measure it accurately. It turns out the next step was there was a good correlation between those rigorous, reasonably precise and accurate scientific measurements and stuff that cities already know how to measure when it comes to street sweeping and is relatively easy to measure. Wet weight, dry weight. In some cases, they're talking about taking samples, putting them into small ovens, drying them off, and then doing some analytics on them. This is all stuff that city public works departments can do. And what we found was that the simplest measurements have a good correlation, but fairly rough. And then as you get to slightly more sophisticated, like this dry weight measurement, for instance, the correlation becomes tighter and tighter. And that gets important because of the next step. The next step is to incorporate this analysis, but also the data collection that cities can do into their stormwater regulatory system. So if they're using street sweeping to remove significant amount of phosphorus, their stormwater regulations require them to remove this type of phosphorus. They can now measure and come up with a good, reasonably accurate estimate of the phosphorus that they are actually pulling out of their system. And this is a good enough measurement that it is recognized by the state regulatory agency. This is why the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was willing and able to help fund this research in order to build this crediting system. So now all the MS4 cities can do reasonably simple measurements of their street sweeping, estimate the phosphorus that's removed, and claim credit for that under their stormwater regulations, either just the MS4 permit or making demonstrated progress toward meeting a required TMDL nutrient load reduction. This is big news for cities. All of this work now can be linked to an enhanced street sweeping program. So for instance, here in Minnesota, most cities for a long time now essentially do 2 street sweepings a year. They do 1 street sweeping at the end of winter. So, they've been applying sand, salt, all kinds of stuff to mitigate some of the dangers of ice on our streets. And you've got a general buildup of dirt from the snow, et cetera, over the winter. So you get to the end of the season and it's appropriate to come along and try to remove all that stuff, or as much as you can, from the streets. And then the cities also do a street sweeping toward the end of fall. So they're trying to pick it up after most of the leaves have fallen. And they'll use the street sweeping to pick up that. Also, the street dirt and such that's out there as well. Now you can do an enhanced street sweeping program. And here it gets into interesting territory because in the earlier work, this actually wasn't discussed during the webinar a couple weeks ago. The earlier work done 7, 8 years ago, mostly in the city of Prior Lake, south of the Twin Cities, they looked at this close linkage between tree canopy cover and street sweeping. And what they found was you could work out GIS routines based on the tree canopy cover, link those to your planning in terms of how often you were going to sweep your streets, and also link it to the phenology of the trees. When are the trees dropping seeds? When are they dropping flowers? When are the leaves coming down? And you can now design optimized street sweeping routes and frequency so that you get the most cost effectiveness out of your street sweeping program. And in some cases, you're out sweeping streets every 2 weeks instead of just twice a year. So that's an enhanced street sweeping program, and it can be enormously productive. So these things there's information kind of embedded in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual about this sweeping route optimization work. You got to work a little bit to find it these days, but it's in there.
Let me break in here and say,
yeah, please.
One of the things that when I got started with this 3 years ago, 1988, whatever that was, a lot of cities were, when a big rain event would be coming, they'd say, oh, well, we don't have to sweep them because there's going to be a rain event in 5 days and they'll just wash it all away.
Yep.
Or they got flusher trucks and flushed it down the drains and out into the rivers, and when there was not a combined system. So this is a real departure from that, and we have to go with the science. Here at the tail end, we hope, of the COVID era, there's all this talk about whether you watch the science or you don't. Well, this is, folks, the science of what's going on the streets. And so that's a real big part of the way to listen to what Randy is talking about is they've done the analytical science back work that needs to be done. And I also want to bring up that the cost, it turns out to be enormously less expensive to remove this material with a sweeper than it does any other way. And this exactly correlates to what was found with Dr. John Sansaloni's study that he led in Florida. So you have these two disparate locales, Minnesota and Florida. We could hardly be more different in the United States. And they're both coming up to say that if you're interested in removing the pollutants out of your runoff stream, sweeping is by far your most cost-effective method. Now, and another aspect of this, when you're talking about the stormwater side of it, is there's money in the stormwater side of it that there is not in sweeping. So I will jump back on my soapbox here a minute to say, combine your sweeping department with your stormwater department. Now you can have combined budgets. And the idea here is to use the science, and you sweep at a frequency such that, obviously, if you sweep once a year, you're going to get a lot of material. If you sweep once an hour, not so much. So let's find what the sweet spot is, where the cost of picking up, as your cost rises per pound of pollutant, as your frequency drops. In other words, you're sweeping more frequently, and now so you have the same fixed costs, but the amount of material you're picking up that's polluted and otherwise is less, so the cost per pound goes up. Well, when that cost rises such that the curves cross to where the cost is now such that you should maybe be doing more with your catch basins or grassy swales or whatever else you're doing, then move to that. But you really need to combine those departments so you're not fighting over it, and so you can allocate this cost-effective money to your sweeping department from your stormwater fees. So that's, I'll jump off my soapbox and give this back to Rand.
No, those are all great points, Ranger, and really important stuff. One of the curious things is, you were talking about a change in mindset. We in the stormwater world, we tend to view streets as kind of sources of pollutants and problem areas. And we don't view them as kind of useful stopping points for pollutants. Stuff from lawns, stuff from cars settles onto the streets. And until a big rainstorm comes along, they're there and available to be picked up at relatively low cost, and then actually removed from the system. So streets are actually an interesting opportunity and collection point for pollutants, where we can reach them and get to them. And we got a little ways to go in terms of having a lot of people and programs recognizing that. Um, the cost numbers that you cited are worth quantifying briefly. So one of the things that a good bit of work here in Minnesota has gone into looking at the cost of withdrawing phosphorus from stormwater systems on a essentially dollars per pound removed basis. What we found is that at certain times of the year, we're able to remove phosphorus using sweeping at less than $100 a pound. That number is amazing. Phosphorus is difficult to remove. We try to infiltrate stormwater to get it out of the system. We use rain gardens and grassy swales. We hope for vegetative uptake of phosphorus. And with those types of systems, here in Minnesota, we are happy to be able to remove phosphorus for something like $5,000 a pound when we're using rain gardens and swales. That's 50 times more expensive. I've worked with people in cities on the East Coast where their numbers are more like $17,000 to $20,000 a pound to remove phosphorus. And in a lot of cases, it's even difficult to actually measure what you've removed. A lot of times those numbers are based on models and estimates and looking at one rain garden and then extrapolating removing rates to the other 57 rain gardens that you may have in your city. In this case, we're actually measuring the stuff that's ending up in a pile in the public works yard and properly disposed of and taken out of the system. And the cost is amazingly low. This is arguably one of the most important pieces of news in this entire story, because this now may be one of the most cost-effective ways we know of to remove phosphorus and other nutrients as well from urban stormwater systems. That's huge news. It means that every regulated city in the country, again, more than 7,500 cities, should be looking at this. All those regulated cities should be talking to their state agency to ask their state agency to look at street sweeping and to build a similar regulatory crediting system into their state regulations, the same way that we're moving toward doing that in the state of Minnesota.
Well,
all huge news.
That's also what's occurring in the state of Florida. And so that has to transfer, that has to keep going to every state because this is such big news that it's definitely something that needs to happen. And it's my understanding Michigan is following what you're doing there, and they may go to that, or is that not the case?
I hate to say it, but I just don't know.
Okay.
It's kind of remarkable how many, I mean, we have lots of things going on in the stormwater world, and yet there's relatively little networking, passing of information. We have duplication of ideas, but we also have places where we're learning important lessons. And for some reason, it takes 5 to 10 years for those important lessons to be widely disseminated. The stuff's just, it's hard to make progress.
Yeah, I so wish we had a council of sweeper manufacturers and major suppliers, because that would be the logical way to get this news out and transmit it around the country and around the world, because water quality is degrading quickly, and time is of the essence, that's for sure. And one of the other things that comes to the fore here, Randy, that I'll jump back on a soapbox a minute, is car removal, vehicle removal. If you know that your sweepers are picking up your phosphorus or nitrogen, whatever you're after, so much more cost effectively than anything else you can do, then you owe it to your city or whatever you're sweeping to maximize the amount of material you're going to be picking up. I know there's a lot of pushback about vehicle removal in a lot of areas, but I'll just put the seed out there and contact World Sweeper for more information. But there are, and I can point you to the articles we've done, but there are technology out there now that can tell how many vehicles you're missing when you move away from the curb and then back to the curb with your sweeper. You can put that on, and now you know, if you know how much material you were picking up on that route, now you can assess directly how much material you're missing and get a handle on that. So you can go to your city council and so forth and say, here's what we're doing, here's how much better we could do. And I think that's something the EPA needs to latch onto also, because everybody's supposed to do the best job practicable that they can. And
maximum extent practicable is the term. And it only took me 6 or 7 months of constant practice to be able to say that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so we have to say it is practicable a lot more so than it was to move cars previously. There's technology now that can interact with your city databases. Your citizens can get the app, they can log on, even without an app. They can log on to your city website and ask for notifications. The notifications can come to their phone or their computer or whatever they'd like. They can receive a notification, let's say the day before the sweeper's coming. They could receive another one, let's say a mile before the sweeper gets there, and another one when it goes past their address. And how will that help, you might say, when you have to move your car for 4 hours? Well, you can also put a camera on that sweeper. And in addition to being able to give out tickets to the cars that happen to not have moved, so people don't have to stay away for 4 hours and your sweeper will be less likely to be impacted. But that same camera can be affixed with software that will allow you to note potholes that are occurring, or abandoned vehicles, or tree branches that are down, or any number of other things that might be important to you. You can even have them give automatic notices with a GPS stamp to the appropriate department, and they can come out and fix that pothole or remove the branch. So it's getting more and more practical and practicable to move those vehicles. And so that's another aspect of this that really needs to be factored in, is vehicle removal is critical in some areas with sweeping.
Yep. And similar technologies are linked to this optimization process in relation to tree canopy cover. So we're now using satellite data that is processed by computers to develop maps with tree canopy cover shown for cities related to the streets. You look at 10, 20, 30 feet back from the street. And then you can use that data to optimize the routing of your street sweepers, the frequency and the seasonal timing of your routes as well. Again, more GIS, but work we know how to do now.
Yeah, that's excellent information, Randy. What else should we be talking about in this endeavor between us?
Well, let's see. Let's go 2 slides. So now you're looking at this question from the perspective of a regulated city. Most of the cities in the United States are nowadays. So your city ought to be looking at all of this. You should be talking with your state to have the state recognize this work and create a crediting program. We have movement toward this in various states and regions around the country. Within the Chesapeake Bay TMDL drainage area, for instance, most of the mid-Atlantic states, there's work in this direction going on right now. And then incorporate street sweeping at a significantly higher level into your public works program and your stormwater program. So now you can use stormwater utility funds if your city has a stormwater utility set up. You can access things like state revolving fund monies, mostly used for drinking water and wastewater work, but increasingly being directed towards stormwater work to pay for additional street sweepers, additional operations work. You can get the tree canopy cover data for your city and use it to optimize your street sweeping routes and timing, and then quantify the results and benefits of your sweeping and claim the regulatory credits that your city needs and deserves for this type of work, some of which you're already doing. You can find all of this information in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. And so I would strongly encourage municipal public works folks all over the country to be looking into this more carefully and deciding how it could be applicable for your city and your program.
Yes, very good. That's absolutely what needs to be done. Sweeping has for too long in too many places been kept away from the stormwater end of things because people just didn't realize how cost effective sweeping is. In fact, many times more cost effective, as we've heard, than any other method for reducing pollutants. And the two pollutants that have been studied extensively are nitrogen and phosphorus. There may be other pollutants in your area, in which case it's time for you to lead a study. Let's find out about that. But it's highly likely to be the case as well. And we also know that it's by far the least expensive way to just remove material from your streets, which can, create safety hazards and that sort of thing as well.
Yes, yes, indeed. So now we should go to the next slide, because you've kind of teed it up for what to do next. You talked about the different pollutants. The work here in Minnesota, which has been, I mean, we've been working on this for 8 years, and it was an uphill struggle to get this work funded. Doing important, productive, fruitful work like this shouldn't be so difficult, but it is. But there's more work to be done. We have focused on nutrients, but an obvious one, for instance, is trash. This is going to vary depending on different areas within a city. You're going to have some neighborhoods, commercial areas, downtown, really densely populated areas. You're going to have a lot more trash. You've got less out in suburban residential type areas. We have dirt and solids everywhere. And as you mentioned earlier, what happens to most of that material right now is a good sized storm comes along, it's flushed off the street, and it ends up in our streams, rivers, lakes, wetlands. If we can, we need to look at how much of that material is being picked up in street sweepings, and how that can be reduced in terms of pollutants downstream. The last one that's not really written here is bacteria. Literally the largest number of TMDLs around the United States are focused on bacteria as the pollutant. What we're talking about here, for instance, is cases where the ocean beaches or lake beaches can't be used for swimming anymore because there's too much bacteria in the stormwater runoff, and people end up getting sick. It's stuff we don't want to have happening. And we now have regulatory standards, but it's an enormously difficult pollutant to chase. Bacteria is everywhere, and every place bacteria settle, they tend to grow on their own. So we have some really nice analytic and study work. City of Minneapolis did a big study on bacteria in their system. And to some extent, almost everywhere you look, you find bacteria. Not surprisingly, really. One of the places they found consistently very high levels were in street gutters. Not a big surprise. Well, it turns out street sweeping may have a really big impact on being able to remove bacteria. How we're going to analyze that is going to be an interesting challenge for the researchers. But just as it's proved to be fruitful when we look at nutrients, I suspect there's good reason to believe that it would be equally fruitful on the bacteria side as well.
Well, let me jump in here. I'm located in the Pacific Northwest, really smack between Seattle and Vancouver, British Columbia. And we have frequent closures here, and it's a farming community and a big growing area. They grow more tulips here than anywhere else in the world outside of Holland, as just an example, in the Skagit Valley. And they have the closures for the oyster farms and so forth that they just can't harvest. It costs them millions of dollars, and of course the people can't swim and so forth. And how they will quantify that, I don't know. Early on, I was interested. Well, I say early on, 15 years ago, I looked at some of the things that would eat oil, as an example, and I was assured by the person that had recently taken over that area of the EPA that he would never allow on a national level to spray parking lots with these oil-eating bacteria, which seem to have no downside that we could find at all. They're being used on a state-by-state basis, where you'd spray that and they would actually eat the oil. As long as they had oil and moisture, they would gobble the stuff up. They would become inert. They could go into the water, wouldn't hurt a thing. But on a national level, it just looked impossible to do. There may be something like that that can be sprayed. Keep in mind that sweepers spray a water spray to keep the dust down. And it may be that something that would be benign that could be put into the spray of a sweeper might make a difference for bacteria. We're going a little far afield with that, but who knows? They thought that was phosphorus and nitrogen too, folks. So
yeah, that gets into really tricky territory because yeah, but you get into antibacterial agents, and one of the things that you find is, yes, maybe they kill a good percentage, even a really large percentage of the bacteria, but it turns out, I mean, this is happening in antibiotics. What's left?
Yeah.
What's left is the really, yes, the really strong and possibly incredibly dangerous stuff. And that then moves into the ecosystem and takes it over. And now you have a problem that's actually a whole lot worse than what you had to begin with. So we're gonna need to be really careful there.
Good reminder. That's right.
Yes.
That's a complete good reminder. Well, what
so
left out?
Well, before we leave these next steps, one of the things to consider is how this all affects the other stormwater best management practices that are installed downstream. And there's a couple things going on there. One is, a good example is, we have constructed stormwater ponds now by the tens of thousands all over the country. And really what they do is they just stop the stormwater, dirt and pollutants that are attached to the dirt settle out, and then the stormwater moves on in a somewhat more controlled fashion. It addresses both flood control, but also water quality improvement. One of the things that happens in stormwater ponds is they fill up with dirt. It's what they're supposed to do. And over time, they literally fill up to the point where they no longer serve their function. You know, you lost the wet volume that you had. If we can remove significant amounts of dirt through street sweeping, we may be able to extend the life of all those stormwater ponds, which now, instead of having to dredge them every 7 to 10 years, now they have to be dredged every 20 to 25 years. Well, it turns out that can save hundreds of thousands of dollars for each pond. On the other hand, though, if cities, these regulated cities right now, are getting regulatory credit for the work that those ponds are doing, if the street sweeping is removing a significant amount of the nutrients before the water gets to the ponds, we may need to adjust the crediting downward for the ponds, even as we adjust the crediting upward for the street sweeping.
Mhm.
It's still all going to make sense. The last piece here that fascinates me is one of the things, obviously, that we're chasing are leaves of trees. You know, they're ending up in the street. Right now, we have this great system for mobilizing the phosphorus in leaves. We systematically pulverize the leaves in the street to make very small particles. That process is called driving over them repeatedly. And now those smaller particles become much more mobile. And because they're a lot smaller, they decompose more quickly and the nutrients end up in the system more quickly. But these leaves are a big deal. We're still only talking in terms of the leaves in the street. And Ranger, can you show the next slide, please? This is kind of a Minnesota phenomenon, so this may not make a whole lot of sense to you in Washington State, but we have this interesting white frozen substance in the winter here in Minnesota called snow, and our stormwater systems essentially freeze up for 5 to 6 months of the year. But what happens is, at the end of the winter, we have snowmelt. And it's a little hard to see. You can see this blue line that's embedded in all these black dots. And what you'll see are 3 peaks for phosphorus. One of them is in the fall, associated with the leaves. The one in the middle is the spring, which would be the seeds and flowers from the trees mostly. But then that other significant peak at the beginning is the phosphorus in the snowmelt water at the end of the winter. That is a lot of phosphorus. We don't really know where that phosphorus is coming from. I suspect that what's going on there is you've got leaves on residential lawns that have been covered by snow for most of the winter. They have decomposed to a certain extent under that snow. And now then when the snow mobilizes, that phosphorus also moves into the system. One of the things we can do, this isn't directly related to street sweeping, but I'm a stormwater guy, so I'm still curious, is maybe if we chase those leaves and remove significant numbers of those leaves more effectively than we do right now, that would also be a significant way to lower the amount of phosphorus that's moving through our urban stormwater systems. And my guess is that will also be spectacularly cost effective. So that's something I'm really interested in trying to quantify. And then cities do a certain amount of assistance in terms of helping their residents remove leaves. But again, if the city gets a stormwater regulatory credit, now the city has the motivation to set up a really good, robust leaf collection system to get those leaves out of the system completely.
As an anecdote, I wrote a story, it's probably been 8 or 10 years ago, that was just about leaf pickup. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll talk to a dozen cities and see how they handle it. And to my astonishment, 6 of them said, oh, we put a lot of emphasis in it, and here's what we do to get the leaves off the ground. And 6 of them said, we quit sweeping when the leaves fall. That's how long we sweep, and we don't want to sweep those leaves. It's too much trouble. So
Yep.
those folks need to pay attention, because we're talking about a lot of phosphorus in the leaves. One other topic I wanted to bring up is parking lots, and that's been left off. We're removing all the material we can from the streets and so forth, but I know I've spoken to, on behalf of sweeping contractors, to a couple of municipalities in the Northeast, and they were charging the malls, in this case, in both of these cases, for their impervious surface areas. So they had a stormwater runoff fee based on the impervious surface, how many square feet of parking lot and roof that they had on their property.
Yes.
And our argument to them was that at the time, both of these properties were getting swept 7 days a week. So is there some kind of an enhanced sweeping that can be mandated or done in those areas that will then be known to remove those pollutants, because there wasn't much able to run off if you're sweeping 7 days a week, and yet they're having to pay this fee. And both municipalities said the same thing to me after hearing the argument out, and they said, Ranger, if we did that, then everybody'd want to do that, and we've come to rely on the tax money, so we can't be doing that. That's how that went.
Yep.
That's going to become the next thing to look at, I think, is the runoff before it gets to the streets. How can we regulate that and maybe have in some areas a mandated thorough sweep, maybe that's a certified sweep of some kind that happens, say, once a week or once every 2 weeks, or we fill in the blanks later. But
yes.
If we can hit this material before it gets to the street and then hit it at the street also, it's being done on these parking lots anyway. And so, is there a way to look at that, regulate it, and so forth?
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And to be perfectly honest, I haven't thought about it at all before. It gets interesting because one of the things that's going on in the stormwater world is we have these areas of kind of enormous challenge. So a lot of the stuff we do in stormwater, things like putting in rain gardens and stormwater ponds and swales, all that kind of stuff, take up space. And if you're in a second tier suburb of a large metropolitan area, you've got a good bit of space in those kind of suburbs to do this kind of work. But as you get closer to the core cities, but also as you get in areas where you've got dense multifamily housing or dense commercial development, you now have these stormwater regulatory standards, but you've got literally no space at all to work with. Or if you do have space, it's just incredibly expensive, right?
And so what that means is it may not be practicable, is the argument.
Well, yeah, you would think. But what's happening is people are doing really expensive things to meet the stormwater standards. So what you have now are underground stormwater treatment systems. Some of them are really big. I know I've got a large shopping center a mile or so away, and they put in underground vaults the size of Chicago when they expanded the shopping center, the commercial. The only way they could get the expansion was to meet the stormwater regs. And to meet the stormwater regs, they had to do this really expensive stuff. Those, my guess is those places are not yet looking at street sweeping, parking lot sweeping, as one of the ways that they can meet some of their stormwater regulations. That's fascinating territory.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's also very different territory than where I work. You know, I work with cities, and as a general rule, the cities aren't sweeping these lots. It's all being done by private contractors.
yeah.
That's just a whole different universe.
As the director of the World Sweeping Association, also, let me say that those contractors can handle it if we figure out what they need to do. You know, we can get that job done. One last thing I'd like to make sure everybody recognizes too. You were talking about these cars that trample the leaves and they're hardly recognizable as leaves anymore.
Yeah.
One of the things we learned early on, and I might say that I want to say that broom sweepers are better now than they were previously, so certainly 20, 30 years ago. However, there have been some studies done that show that what a broom sweeper does, now think about sweeping your floor rather than vacuuming your floor. So the broom sweeper goes over with these big transverse brushes, and they brush everything up into a conveyor belt that goes into the hopper. But you have what's called a deposition layer on the street. And so that hard packed layer is keeping the small stuff that's in the cracks of the pavement from washing off in the next rain or wind event. Now, it can be that if you sweep with just broom sweepers, and I know those are great for that white stuff that you were talking about at the end of the year. They
Yes.
want those to be able to come in and do your spring cleanup. However, you shouldn't probably stay with those broom sweepers. You should probably go with air sweepers after that, because a broom sweeper can brush off that deposition layer, not take the small stuff. If the pollutants you're after tend to be in the small stuff, and a lot of times that's the case, they can throw the dust up in the air, it settles back down. Now that's not hard packed anymore. It's ready for a wind to blow it or rain to wash it off into the waterways. And we have seen at least one study that showed that a broom sweeper could go along and be followed almost directly by an air sweeper, and the air sweeper would pick up 500 pounds per curb mile of all small debris, which tends to be more porous, which can have more pollutants. So that's just a caution to those out there trying to spec your sweeper. Think about the differences between an air sweeper and a broom sweeper, and know the differences. And if you don't, give us a call and we'll help you out.
One of the nice things about the more recent work that the University of Minnesota's done and Bill Selbig, the USGS guy in Madison, is they looked at different types of sweepers and their performance. So you can dig into the data and these papers and find the information about the variance in terms of performance.
I think I'll just call Bill and get him on a Zoomcast.
There you go. That would be excellent. You should also talk to Sarah Hobby. Sarah Hobby was one of the lead researchers at the University of Minnesota. And one of the great things about having Sarah involved is her specialty is leaf decomposition. I'm almost certain she's the first leaf decomposition specialist who was also one of the lead researchers on a street sweeping study.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that too.
Yeah, I know. Selbig, for instance, is really interested in the variation between tree species. Because not surprisingly, I mean the number of leaves, the surface area of the leaves, and also the nutrient content of the leaves and how they decompose vary from species to species.
Sure.
And so some of his data is indicating that that's worth paying attention to as well.
Makes sense. Out here we have a lot of needles that might be on the ground, as an example, or it may, we have fewer deciduous trees, and what part of the needles don't really drop as much. So if your tree cover is coniferous, that's one thing. If it's deciduous, that's another. So
yeah, Well, you've also got completely different rainfall patterns. You
Mhm.
get very few large storms, and you just get scads of really small drizzly type storms, and that's a whole different pattern and affects the stormwater runoff in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah,
Makes it unique.
yeah.
Just one of the unique things about the
One of the
Pacific
unique things that
Northwest.
they had this has nothing to do with sweeping, folks, so you can tune out. At the Pike Place Market, the famous Pike Place Market where they throw the fish, these folks came in with a fancy umbrella store, and they thought they'd make a killing, and they learned that the people in the Pacific Northwest don't buy umbrellas. We just live with the rain. And they went out of business quite shortly. So
You learn to love it.
we do learn to love it. Well, I think it's probably time to share this screen and say thank you to some of the other people that made this showcase possible with Randy today. And if you would go through that and say who Mike Trojan is. Mike was the lead in the webinar and kind of the coordinator of that.
Yes.
And he's also a person of real significance in the stormwater scene.
He is indeed. So we owe a huge thank you to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Like I said, this is 8 years of work that's been going on, but it's also a commitment by a regulatory agency to build a crediting system that, one, helps the environment and moves things along in a positive way, but also provides regulatory credits to the regulated parties, in this case, mostly the regulated cities. And so the PCA just did a really nice job of being willing to work on this, to put money into it, staff effort, et cetera, et cetera. Mike Trojan is staff at the PCA and was one of the people that really led this effort and kind of kept the commitment in place over the years. You've also heard me mention the Minnesota Stormwater Manual several times. Mike is the person who organizes the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. And it's really a remarkable resource, not just for street sweeping, but a whole pile of other important stormwater information. And a good bit of that is Mike's doing. So the PCA's commitment and work on this is hugely appreciated. The researchers have done brilliant work on this, and that's the team from the University of Minnesota, but then also the USGS folks in Madison. And then Tetra Tech did a really nice job on putting the crediting system together. And that work is not yet complete. You'd want to listen to the webinar to hear much more detail about that. But then once that's complete, it will be written into the Minnesota Stormwater Manual and available for all the regulated parties in the state of Minnesota, but then also a valuable resource for anybody else and any other state in the United States or around the world, that for that matter, who are interested in taking a similar approach in their own jurisdiction. So
if you're
excellent work.
Yeah, if you're interested or needy, let's say, to get the pollutants out of your stormwater system, take this stuff to heart. And the holy grail here is the credits, in my opinion. Find a way to get this information to your own state's pollution control agency, whoever that is. Talk to your legislators and so forth, and do what it takes to get these credits enacted. And ideally, and ultimately, hopefully we can get them through the EPA on a national basis and have this credited out, through the Stormwater Act or something similar. So,
well, and folks should know that through the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, we are now having conversations with EPA headquarters staff and other national stormwater experts around this topic. So hopefully we'll be able to make some progress on that front as well.
Yeah, I sure hope so. And thanks for your good work in that. And I think we, just to, for your own job security, I think we need to, on my end, thanks Stantec for providing you here
Thanks.
today to bring this information out, because it's so vital and so very important. So unless you have something else to offer there, Randy, I'll leave them with the information they need to contact us if need be. And thank you so much for all of this, all of your efforts behind the scenes, as well as today in bringing it out to the sweeping audience in the United States and around the world.
It's my pleasure, Ranger. I thank you for the opportunity, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks a lot.
Me too. Thank you. All right. And there you see how to find us, and we'll leave you with that.